Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Tristan. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Nearly every technology company can benefit from running a podcast. It helps the company learn from customers, connect with influencers, and provide a perspective on what's really happening in the industry. But how does a company integrate a podcast within its overall inbound marketing strategy? Is a podcast just another box to check, or can it become something bigger for your company? In this episode, I welcome Ben Saylor on the show. Ben is the inbound marketing director at CoSchedule, and he's also the host of the company's podcast, the Actionable Marketing Podcast. Now, this podcast isn't just another flash in the pan. It's been around for 5-6 years so far. And in this conversation, we'll uncover what it takes to make your company's podcast a big part of your inbound marketing strategy. Ben, first of all, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show. It's fun to be on the other side of an interview every once in a while.
I know. I enjoy it myself. You know, it's good to flip or change hats, so to speak. So we got your other hat on today. So I want to start with this notion that there are a lot of fluffy podcast episodes out there where information isn't necessarily helpful to the audience, right? And you run and host the Actionable Marketing Podcast at CoSchedules. So what do you consider the difference between actionable takeaways in a podcast format versus something that's just fluffy and not helpful?
I think the biggest difference is with any type of content that you could describe as actionable, you are leaving your listener or your reader or viewer, depending, I think this extends beyond just podcasting, but you're leaving people with something that they can actually go do, something they can actually go implement. And if you've done your job correctly, you've given them the information that they need to actually go do something. I think where content, whether it's a podcast, a blog post, a video show, whatever the case may be, I think when things get fluffy or start to feel like there's just nothing there, I think a lot of times you kind of end up with results that feel that way because there's no real strategy behind it. There's no real thought put behind it. There's no real consideration for the consumer of that content and what they're going to get out of it. I think with podcasting specifically, I think you tend to hear a lot of shows that might feel fluffy. Not to call out anyone specifically, but I think, and I think that this extends even beyond just marketing shows or just B2B business shows. I think in general, I think podcasts tend to kind of veer into fluff territory when the host goes into a show unprepared, or if they don't have a clear idea of the direction they even want a conversation to take, or a point that they're even trying to work toward with a guest. I think sometimes there's a tendency, I think, to just kind of press record and let the conversation flow.
Yep.
And that's I think that's more fun for the host and the guest than it is for anybody listening, right? Because you might feel like you're having an awesome conversation with somebody, but to anyone listening, it's just this is just meandering
it's two folks
nonsense
on a Zoom call. Yeah.
Right. Which is sometimes that approach can work, but it's a dice roll, right? That you're gonna hit on anything that a listener is going to be able to extract, any value.
Yeah, and I think there's something we talk about a lot, which is the intent behind your conversation. I think that's
Yep.
what you're talking through as well,
Yep.
and that's something that I really see with a lot of your episodes where. Because you bring folks on, you're not having an hour-long conversation. It's kind of this tight 20 to 30-minute piece, but it starts
Mhm.
with something like you've seen something from them or their company. There's some detail there that you want to explore, and that's kind of where
Yep.
you start versus like this really broad conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about your show and CoSchedule's show is that it's been around for a long time. And I wanted to ask, like, you started at CoSchedule in 2015, I believe, and which was around
Yep.
the same time, right, that the podcast started. But you actually didn't even start hosting until 2020. I think it was I have episode 168, I believe, and I think you were the third host. So how did you get involved with hosting the company show? How did you jump into that role?
Yeah. So our head of marketing, Nathan Ellering, started the show. And then I had a colleague here, Eric Piella, who's a great person, extremely smart marketer. I can't remember what his job title was, but he did PR for us for a little while and hosted the podcast, I think for a year or two. He was an excellent hype man. He has maybe more energy than any other person I've ever met.
Yeah.
So I think that he did a really great job with I don't know, just kind of giving the podcast kind of a more energetic feel
Right.
than what I feel like I bring to it. But he ended up leaving us to take another role at another company, and so I took over the show after he departed.
Well, Ben, because your background was on the writing side, right?
Yep.
And that was your role there. So what was your biggest fear taking over the reins of the podcast host for
Sure.
CoSchedule?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I had hosted a couple episodes previously just to kind of fill in.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know, like maybe like two or three episodes just where there was a need for someone to just kind of step in and cover. Um, I don't know. I mean, I felt fairly comfortable with it because I've been a freelance journalist like in my spare time for like 15 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've interviewed a lot of people over that time. So I felt pretty comfortable with just with interviewing people
Right.
in general. But I think maybe the biggest fear that I had was I wasn't super used to those conversations being public,
Yeah.
right? Like in a format where, like, yeah, you can do some editing on a podcast. Like if someone misspeaks or a car alarm goes off in the background or something weird, like you can edit stuff out. But there's a limit to how much you can polish a podcast episode before you're not offering an honest representation of how that conversation actually went. And so I think that was maybe like the biggest thing that I kind of need to get over was just I think the need for things to be perfect, and
Yeah.
like not overthinking everything that you're saying just because like 1,000 people are going to hear it. It's, people aren't judging you that closely,
Yeah.
really. So
And I think that's the thing is folks think that the listener or the viewers are putting every episode under this microscope, and they're really
yeah,
not. So how did
no.
you overcome that fear? Was it just reps? Like, is that what it was, or was there something specific you did there?
Uh, to tell you the truth, I would say it's just reps. I think it's
Yeah.
kind of my attitude toward like taking on anything new was you just have to do it enough times. I kind of treat things like that as just being like a learning opportunity. And I think with anything that you're trying to learn, you can't ever go into it with the expectation that you're going to be amazing at it immediately.
Right.
And, even though I had a lot of experience interviewing people, I had no experience running a show. And so there's a lot of things to learn, and a lot of things I think I've got a better grasp on now than I did maybe when I started the show. But I think like the only things that I really did are just the things that I always do with anything new, and it's just embrace a healthy degree of failure and just think of it as an opportunity to figure things out rather than like this daunting, overwhelming thing that's got to be flawless right off the bat. So
just start to chip away at it.
Yeah, for sure.
And Ben, I was listening to an interview that you had. You were on Castos' podcast with Craig Hewitt. Yeah, we've had Craig on this show actually, and I was listening to that to get some of your thoughts there. And one of the things that you said, let me just pull up here, is that you view CoSchedules podcast as a way to have conversations with marketers without having to worry about SEO. You could just have these conversations without doing a keyword search to start the process. So if that's the case, I'm curious to know like how you tie the podcast into CoSchedules' inbound marketing strategy.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I think first off, I should probably say, I think with each episode, we do because we post every episode on our blog, and we apply the bare minimal basics of, SEO best practice to those. And occasionally one of those will pick up, traffic through search, but that's not a priority. I think, but to more directly answer your question though, like where does it fit in our overall strategy? I think the simplest answer I can provide is it's just an amazing relationship building tool. Every time we bring on a guest on the show, that's potentially a new connection for us. It also helps us get our brand in front of their audience too. So being able to do that each week, I think there are a lot of compound benefits that way. Some of it's hard to quantify. I think it can be a little bit difficult to measure, but we know that it's providing value, and we know that we're reaching new people, every time we ship an episode. It's also a really good opportunity for us to just hear from other people in the industry, to hear from other marketers, to learn from what they're doing, to learn from, how they've attacked, specific problems. And so I think for myself, I benefit personally from it a lot that way. And then by extension, the company benefits just from being able to absorb, other people's knowledge that way. We kind of think of it like each episode in a sense is kind of like getting 30 minutes of free consulting on a given topic or a given thing. And, and like sometimes like not every episode is necessarily going to be about anything that's directly applicable to anything that we're going to do. But there's always value, I think, in just broadening, your lens and your perspective on, what are things that modern marketers care about? What are their problems? What are they doing to solve those problems? And so there's a lot of value in it for us. And that's before we even get into the value that provides to an audience. Right. So something that's great about podcasting is that you maybe have someone's attention for literal seconds, maybe even maybe even a fraction of a second. And they're not always going to take an action that is in any way valuable to you. After they see a post, if you can get people to read a blog post, you might get 4 to 5 minutes of their time at most, maybe less than that. But with a podcast, you've got 20 to 30 to 45 minutes to an hour of someone's time where you've really got their attention. So even though like our podcast on average gets about 1,100 downloads per episode, which if we compare that to something like our blog, which gets hundreds of thousands of hits per month, that looks like it's providing a fraction of the value that the blog is, right? But it's important to keep in mind that it's a different type of value. And you kind of just have to conceive of it a little bit differently. There really is no other format except maybe a video show. If you've got a really good video show, maybe it kind of follows a similar principle. But if you can get somebody's attention for 45 minutes, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And
I think the argument there is it's even beyond attention, right? Because it's like you've piqued the interest, but then they're actually really going through the information, and it's at a different level there, which I think speaks to your piece here. If you got a blog post, 4 minutes time on page, and then versus, you're playing the podcast on your walk or what have you, that's a completely different dynamic.
Right. Yeah. And that's extremely important, I think, to keep in mind and to mention as well, is that podcasts become a part of people's routine. With a blog post, particularly like if you're running an SEO centric strategy, a lot of times you're only going to get people like reading that content when they have a need for it. And it's possible that they might come to you for one thing and they might bounce and never come back. And like, obviously, there's ways that you can re-engage people. Like you can run retargeting ads. You can get people on an email list. That maybe you can get people to follow your social accounts, and maybe they'll continue to engage with you that way. But a podcast becomes a part of people's routine, and that's really powerful, right? Like if you can become like if someone's like engaging with your brand as like a lifestyle choice, at that point, then that's really powerful. I know for myself, like the podcasts that I really listen to and that I really like follow closely, like whether they're marketing shows or something else, like I've got a handful of shows I listen to all the time, like daily, weekly, whatever the case may be. And that really does a lot to just keep those brands and those media properties, I guess you could call them. It really keeps them top of mind, probably more effectively than their actual websites, do. Yeah. So, I don't know. I think if you're trying to build the case for the value of podcasting, I think that those are all things you have to keep in mind beyond just your raw subscriber count, your downloads, I don't know, like if you're doing anything to track conversions, if you're tracking clicks on links and show notes or things like that. There's a lot of other benefits just beyond those things that I think are collectively, I think really add up to a great deal, of value.
Yeah, we're on the same page there for sure. And Ben, let's take a look at, because like you said, with these episodes, the intention is to have something for the audience to take away. So let's get a sense of how you work through an episode at CoSchedule, because right now there are over 250 published episodes. You all have been doing this for a long time. So how in the world do you keep coming up with new ideas for those episodes?
Yeah, it's extremely simple. And it might not be a very satisfying answer, to tell you the truth. But since we've been doing our show as long as what we have, and because CoSchedule has fairly strong brand awareness anyway, we get pitched a lot of guests. And so we really don't have a shortage of people who want to come on the show. And a lot of times, like, PR agencies and outreach agencies, they'll send you like the one sheet for a guest, and they'll have like, what are their 5 to 7 things that they're an expert on? And to be pretty blunt, like, and not to hopefully hurt anybody's feelings, but a lot of times like the topics that get pitched are fairly generic.
Right.
It'd be like, how do you do social media marketing good? Or just like something like really basic.
Yeah.
But it is useful though to have that information, just to know what can somebody speak on, and then we can develop a somewhat more interesting angle or topic on top of that. So it is useful to have that info. And so like I'll just like kind of review, like who are we getting pitched, who seems to have an interesting story, who seems to have something that they can provide value on. It doesn't have to be like any sort of like groundbreaking, like reinventing the wheel type of visionary, guess. Like, I'm just looking for normal people working in the industry who can speak to a problem that they've got a solution to. That's literally it. From there, the actual structure of the interviews typically follow the same format every time. It's like, what's the topic we're talking about? Like, what's the problem? What's the burning issue, that person can speak to? And maybe it's not even a burning issue. Maybe it's just a fairly ordinary problem that just a lot of people tend to typically struggle with. And then we kind of will establish, like, well, why does that thing matter? Why is it important? What are the potential negative effects that you might experience if you don't address problem XYZ,
right? That
correctly?
Opportunity cost, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then from there, we'll actually start diving into like the practical, like, okay, well, how do you tackle that problem? What do you do about it? What are the takeaways we can leave the listener with, to where at the very least they'll know why that thing matters, and they'll know where to begin figuring out what to do about that thing. And that's the structure that every interview follows. And having that structure in place makes it extremely easy to write the questions. So it really doesn't take that much time to prepare each episode. It's just, you have to just identify like what makes a guest interesting. Mm-hmm. And then just kind of put them in a position to where the conversation is naturally going to draw out their expertise in a way that is useful.
They do. And what you mentioned, finding the angle, right? So if you have a problem and you have a person, like how do you search out that angle or the lens that you're going to explore that certain problem on an episode?
That's a good question. Really, just what I try to do is I'll try to drill down to something specific, just so that the conversation doesn't veer off into being too broad, right?
Yeah.
So I think, for example, we recently did an episode on how can content marketing and product marketing teams work together, with Yag Ganesh from this company called Avoma.
Yeah, Yag's been on this show too. He was episode 2 a while ago on recorded content.
That's amazing. He was a great guest. He's a really interesting guy to talk to. But if you kind of like, so how do you get those two teams to work together? I mean, that's not like a super, that's not like some kind of like genius level topic that was hard to come up with or anything like that, but it's a really common problem. I think particularly, like a marketing team is going to be structured with like a product team and a content team, like typically, like if you're a B2B SaaS company like we are. And I think anybody who's been in that environment probably knows that trying to get those two teams to collaborate effectively and effectively tying the top of the funnel to the bottom when you're kind of spreading out responsibilities across teams, like that's not easy.
Right.
Like the number of companies that get that right are they're in the minority that can actually say with full confidence that they are doing that well. So that's kind of like the kinds of things I try to like zero in on. It's just like, what are things that are actual problems for people that nobody really talks about, or that no one really addresses in clear, concrete terms. Like, these are some things that you can go do. Yeah. And I think it's a basic interviewing skill that I think that maybe not everybody has. I mean, if you're kind of coming at things from a journalistic background, this is basic to you, but if you don't, then it's not. It's like you just have to drill down far enough to into a topic to get into a piece of it that is specific enough to where you can have a focused conversation, and to where you're not veering all over the place trying to figure out what it is you're even getting at because your topic is too broad. Actually, like, one of the greatest lessons I ever learned on how to like really drill down onto a specific topic was in college, at a political science professor that really hammered home like the idea, because like we were trying to come up with like we were assigned with coming up with a topic for a term paper. And, a lot of college students writing term papers tend to really struggle with really understanding and internalizing what it means to have a specific topic. And so my term paper, like my idea was way, way too broad. Mm-hmm. I think I was talking about the impacts of the Iranian Revolution on press freedom. There are literal books upon books written about that, right? And so when I would sit down to try to like write this term paper, I was getting lost trying to provide every minuscule detail about this extremely complex issue that
in an essay
in 12 pages, and it was impossible, because I would get to like page 5 and I'd be like, this is what I am doing is stupid. And so I was struggling with this paper, I mean, for weeks. And it got to the point where I had literally 48 hours to finish this and turn it in. And then I just kind of had like a light bulb moment. And I realized what my professor was trying to tell me what I needed to do was like, I need to find an extremely, extremely narrow detail and drill really deep on that one ultra specific detail. And so I was able to just kind of like focus on like one very small part of that topic. And then once I did that, it became much easier to write the paper, because I had focus, I had creative constraints, I had boundaries on what information did and did not belong in the scope of that term paper. And so it's kind of crazy, but I started all the way over 2 days from my deadline, pulled an all-nighter, finished the paper. I literally printed it out and stapled it 5 minutes before I had to hand it in. It was an unrealistically, I don't know how I pulled it off, but I did, and I got an A on that paper. But the lesson that I learned from that I've been able to apply to a lot of things professionally since then, is you just have to get specific. And I think a lot of podcast episodes, like, they're boring because you don't know what they're actually talking about. It'll be like they'll bring on a guest who's an expert on a given area of marketing, and then they'll try to talk about the entire thing that it is that they do. Like, whether it's, I don't know, it could be anything, like SEO strategy, CRM implementation, like whatever. It's like, those things are too big to fit into a podcast episode. And you'll feel like if you try to like bring on a guest and you try to get too broad, you'll feel yourself getting lost in your own conversation. Like, even if you had questions prepared, it's just going to be too much. So
when you do have the guests, because you mentioned it's not as difficult for you to find guests. We have a lot of inbound inquiries coming into play. So what does your research process look like? Because you mentioned preparation at the top, and you said that you feel like that's what causes this gap a lot of times between something that's very actionable and something that's not.
Yep.
So how do you prepare? Like, what research do you physically go through once you know that John or Sally is going to be a guest?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, it kind of depends on how much knowledge I have personally of what it is that this person's an expert on. If it's something I'm fairly familiar with, then it's pretty easy for me to kind of pick out what is and isn't important and to just like write questions that are going to draw out what I feel is a useful answer. If they're an expert on something that I don't know anything about and that I've never engaged with, like just to toss out an example, like influencer marketing. I've never run an influencer marketing campaign in my life.
Right.
And that's like a type of topic where it's very easy, I think, if you're not familiar with it, to probably have a lot of misconceptions of what it's about, a lot of assumptions about what it's about, probably a lot of negative assumptions that aren't accurate. And so what I'll do in a case like that is I'll just spend some time just like reading or listening to what I can about that topic to be like, okay, so amongst people who are really smart about this stuff, what are they talking about? Like, what are they saying?
So like you as a guest have prepared, you've had this conversation, you've recorded it. Now what happens on your side to get more of that value? Obviously you have the audio piece that's put together, but what else is derived from that conversation?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I'll do my best to answer that. So as far as like my involvement goes, I'm sourcing all of our guests, coordinating with, their publicists, their outreach teams. I'd say 9 times out of 10, that's where our guests come from. I really want to get deeper into just finding people myself.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth. Occasionally, like every once in a while, like I'll just ask people that I think would be interesting to have on the show. The only thing with that is like when you don't have a middleman, like sometimes it can get a little bit more difficult to coordinate. I mean, not that much more difficult, but it is kind of nice to have that buffer where you know that somebody else is managing the person's calendar and is going to make sure they show up. Right. But so I do all that. I write the questions. I conduct the interview. But from there, I just send off the audio files. Like I record an intro, a midsection, a conclusion. I package all that up. I send that off to Podcast Motor. It's the editing company that we work with. They do a fantastic job with cleaning up the audio and getting things ready to ship, and then actually pushing that out to the world so that people can listen to it. We have a design team that we'll have a designer, like once we get things back from them, like we'll have a designer create some graphics for our blog, and I'll oversee that workflow. And then from there, we'll share things on social. We'll share things we'll share it in our email newsletter that goes out to a pretty sizable audience each week. And then it goes to every major podcasting platform.
Right.
But really the piece of it that really makes it possible or like feasible for us is having a third party actually do the heavy lifting with the editing, with pulling the transcripts, putting the show notes together. Like if I had to do all of that myself, I don't think we would do it, to tell you the truth, because it would just take too much time.
Yeah.
It would pretty quickly hit a point where even with as much value as what a podcast provides, it probably wouldn't provide as much value as the 2 or 3 other things I could be doing with the same time that are maybe are more directly tied to revenue. And then just the fact that like once you've got a show that's kind of gotten some attention and you're getting guests pitched to you, As much as I do want to, I think, be more personally selective about just reaching out to people that just I want to talk to, it does make things a lot easier when people come to you or when people are referred to you, because then there's no work involved really beyond just vetting who you think is a good fit.
Yeah, and I will say, for us, our company is not nearly as visible as CoSchedule, obviously. So we do rely on referrals and things like that. So there are a couple other ways that we source guests, and I do a lot of just, extending conversations that I'm already having online on Twitter or LinkedIn. It's like, hey, that was a good comment. I think we should explore that a little further. And actually, I got introduced to you through Brett, who from The Juice, who was actually a guest of ours. We had a good conversation. We were chatting afterward about some other great B2B podcasters, and your name came up, and we talked about you for a little bit offline, and I was like, yeah, Ben would be great. So he made the introduction, and that helps us there. So, guests are a big hurdle for a lot of people. Sounds like you have the luxury of having some of that come inbound, but what else is hard about maintaining consistency?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I wrestle with it too much. I think the biggest thing for me, the biggest things that I worry about is like, one, is this show actually useful to people? And I think for two, at what point, or will we ever reach a point where there's just going to start to be so just like diminishing returns, I guess, on what topics we can really even touch on, because we're going to be hitting, I think it's episode 260 within the next week or two. There's always a ton of stuff you can talk about. There's no end of things you can talk about with marketing, right? But if you're a company with a product with, a target customer base, there's only so many things you can probably talk about through content that directly apply to the people who are maybe most likely to purchase. And so we're not tracking podcast listeners to sales by any means, but everything that you do at the top of the funnel, you do want to be mindful of making the right content for the right people. I think the biggest thing for us is just like, how do we avoid repeating ourselves?
And how do you do that, Ben? Do you like have informal surveys or just questions from listeners? Or like how do you gauge some of that, or how do you get some of that qualitative feedback?
That's a really good question. We don't really do anything. I would say that's maybe something I've kind of mentally identified as a potential problem that we just haven't done anything about yet. But our review scores, like on Apple Podcasts, remain really strong. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we can kind of look at to gauge just how people feel about the show. For someone to take the time to leave a recommendation for our show takes a lot. But sometimes I wonder too if that kind of will skew your scores to really only reflect the people who are really into what you're doing, but they may not represent the bulk of the audience. So I don't know, like maybe running a survey of sorts, that might be a good idea for us, honestly. I could probably even just start asking people that I know just directly, like, what do you think? Like, tell me, like, what do you actually think of this show? Like, I think like one of the downsides, not even a downside, but like, I don't know what to call it. It's not a blind spot. With anything, like there's pros and cons, right? And I think with like practical how-to content, which is really our bread and butter at CoSchedule more so than thought leadership or really anything else. That content is necessary. I think, because if we're doing our jobs as content marketers, we really should be in the business of solving problems for people, for educating people. And that has a tendency to just lend itself to how-to type content. I kind of think that a lot of how-to content has started to develop a bad rap over the years because, and I don't want to get too much on a soapbox or spend too much time on this, but it's just because so much of it looks the same. Because the tactics that people use to execute it largely revolve around copying what's already been done. And there are some realities. This is why I like podcasting, because we can get away from this. But I mean, there's just some realities around what search engines typically reward. If you can fake expertise, I mean, Google's kind of doing some things, I think, to try to get in front of this. I think with regard to doing more to pay attention to who is actually writing content and who tends to write for what outlets, and just using that as a measure of gauging authoritativeness. But I mean, you can fake expertise fairly easily. I mean, to tell you the honest truth, and that can lead to a lot of very samey type content, a lot of copycat content. Just a lot of content that like people don't like, but they consume it anyway because that's all there is for a lot of queries. And that's something that, like, we were talking about Brett from The Juice. Like, I think people should definitely go check out what they're doing if anything I've just said resonates with you in any way.
Yeah, because trying to filter, actually pinpoint the best stuff that's out there.
Right.
Folks, yeah.
Yeah, and trying to, like, not be reliant upon a machine that spits out 10 results where maybe 5 of them drive useful traffic. Like, that's the whole structure of the game with SEO. We can dunk on it all we want, but the reality is, in the B2B world, it's a game all of us more or less have to play, whether we like it or not. And the entire structure of the parameters of that game are designed to create a race to the bottom. But I think that's why people think they don't like how-to content, and they think they want, and not that they think they want, I think there is definitely a place for content that just does more to kind of shape your thinking, or just gets you to think on a more philosophical level, more like differently about things, like more thought leadership type content. I think that brands are hesitant to spend much time creating that kind of content because it doesn't always perform well in search. And with organic social, I mean, it's been years since organic social was genuinely useful.
Yeah.
For
you don't get a lot of like big, huge engagement numbers off of a really tactical how-to post. It's pretty rare.
No. And even with like thought leadership stuff, it's like that kind of stuff tends to do better on social, but even still, the amount of attention and traffic that it gets, like, it's got to be really targeted to be useful, because the numbers won't be very high, but you're aiming for resonance with that type of stuff. But brands want to see numbers. And so something that I kind of struggle with, and something I don't know that we're even doing a good enough job of right now, is like, how do you make something that actually is both practical and stands out and is like entertaining, to consume? Like trying to balance all of those things together is very difficult.
It is hard. And do you think, Ben, because I was wondering, with 6-7 years of material out there on the podcast, like, is there something that you have on the horizon that you might introduce to maybe balance those two things out that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think I don't know if there's nothing that I'm probably ready to share just yet. And maybe nothing that would necessarily like immediately stand out to people. I think I think for one, we're probably going to have to start rethinking the way we approach the things we're doing right now. And that could be as simple as just taking a different approach to how-to content, just with regard to, what kind of personality do we bring to it? Whatever we do now or in the future, like I can kind of see us starting to think more in terms of what would a reader or a potential customer think about or care about, and then how do we work backwards from that question, rather than starting with what do we got to do to just beat the guy next to us.
Well, I think the lesson here for folks is, and really what I want to draw a connection with is, CoSchedule's been doing this for 7 years. So there's an immense commitment to consistency there. And even so now with this, this channel, so to speak, that's been out there for a while, you're still just making subtle changes and you keep rolling. And so it's not always about, a revolutionary pivot all the time.
No, nearly never.
Yeah. And I think that's a key thing there. And so what I would like to ask and last question here, to just leave the audience with, if I'm running a show for a tech company, which, most of our listeners and customers are small marketing teams for a tech company. So let's say they're a few episodes in and, they got the podcast rolling, but it's difficult to tell if it's working right now. So what would you say, what words of encouragement would you say now that you're 7 years into this process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if people are just kind of wanting to know, like, whether their content is effective, whether their show is effective, I think first you have to kind of start with the question of why are you creating a podcast? And think about, for your audience, what value is a podcast going to deliver that another type of content or like another type of thing entirely would provide. And so I think I would start with that. And then I would start by asking, well, what can you bring to a podcast? What can you bring to really any channel or type of content? Like, what can you bring to it that you don't think that people are getting from their existing options? And I think if you can start with those two questions, you'll start yourself on the right foot, because for one, like, what the value is to your company, and then you also know what the value is to your audience, like the people that you want to reach. And I think it's really important to get clear on those two things first before you start getting too far, before you get too far along. And like those don't have to be hard questions to answer. Like, I wouldn't overthink it. Just kind of have an idea of who are you trying to create this for and why? Yeah. From there, like, I think it's pretty simple. Like I mentioned, like review scores, like you could run surveys. That's a really good idea, I think. But then you can also think about, like, what is the broader business objective for having a show? And then start thinking like, okay, well, what metrics influence those objectives, right? So let's say that you created a podcast, and this is just a hypothetical. Let's say you created it because you just need to build brand awareness. Like, you're a new tech startup. SEO is maybe almost off the table for you because you don't have the first mover advantage that CoSchedule has.
Right.
Like, it's something that you can do, but it's something that you don't expect. You don't expect that to provide results that you need right now, or as a podcast might. I think that's a pretty common rationale that like a lot of companies kind of follow when they're getting into stuff right now. And I'm assuming this is for somebody, like, we're talking about someone who's getting into the game now.
Yeah, because the audience is typically a smaller team. They're earlier tech startup, maybe even before product market fit in some cases. And like you said, SEO sometimes at that point it's off the table. It's just too expensive to make waves in that direction. So you have to find another way to kind of break through.
Right. Yeah. So I would think so. I think that probably informs then what your goals would be for a podcast. And it probably is to build awareness. And so I would then ask, well, what metrics around a podcast can you track that you can connect to developing awareness? And some obvious things would be like subscriber count, downloads, how much time are people spending listening to the episode, like to each episode? Like, do people typically make it to the end? Like, are they dropping off after a while? Like, how engaged are people? Like, it might be one thing to like get people to subscribe, get people to listen to a few episodes, but are you actually getting people to engage with the show? And then are your numbers, are they growing? Like, they'll probably grow to a certain point and then they might taper off. And then at the point that they taper off, you might have to start rethinking some things. But in the early going, you probably want to see that number at least steadily ticking up over time. So those are the things that I would look at. But I don't think there's any great mystery to it.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that's what we try to articulate too, is there's kind of like this macro level, there's the data that you look at, and then there's like things at a micro level where we encourage folks to grab a snapshot or a screenshot of maybe a tweet or an email that you got where someone actually listened to an episode and said, hey, I like this, and this, or just something very specific and very, one-to-one related where there's no huge download number or report. So if you combine those two things, top level and then things on a one-to-one basis, that helps give people a positive feeling that things are going in the right direction.
Right. So, and I think going in the right direction is just kind of what you're looking for. Like, you're probably not
gut feel, right?
Yeah. You're not going to make a huge splash with anything like immediately. You just want to see momentum in the right direction, and then you just want to keep it going, keep the momentum going, and like things will snowball over time.
Keep it going for about 7 years, like you.
Yeah, I think with anything content related, you don't really get the sugar rush that advertising can give you, where you just throw money at something and then numbers start doing whatever. You really have to be committed for the long haul. And, I think maybe something that's important to keep in mind, and something that affects pretty much everything with content marketing in general that doesn't get discussed enough, is I would encourage everybody listening to learn what they can about change management, because at CoSchedule, we're extremely fortunate to have a leadership team that understands marketing, because we make marketing software for marketers. They have to know that audience. Most people don't have that luxury. And so you're going to be spending some amount of time, potentially even a lot of time if you're not lucky, validating the justification for doing everything that you want to do. And so the better that you can get at seeing things from like a business owner's eyes or a client's eyes or like a stakeholder's eyes, like a lot of people, like there's a lot of advice that goes around. It's like, like the C-suite has to understand marketing, or your clients are stupid because they don't understand marketing. And it's like, no, the problem, if you think that way, the real problem is you're arrogant, and you need to see things from their perspective and frame the story around why you think a podcast is the right play, or why you think anything is going to help build the business. You have to be able to communicate that clearly and effectively in a way that someone who doesn't know anything about it is going to care about.
Yeah. Well, that's a good perspective coming from someone like yourself that's been, running this show for quite a long time. So Ben, I think that's a good spot to end there. And for our folks that are listening, I mean, most of them are probably familiar with CoSchedule, but where can they go to find out more about you and CoSchedule's podcast?
Yeah. So CoSchedule is pretty easy to find. CoSchedule.com. There you can learn about our full suite of marketing calendar and marketing work management software solutions and our headline testing tools. If you want to find more about the podcast, look up Actionable Marketing Podcast on your podcast player of choice, or on Google. You can find our landing page and you can learn more about the show there and see who some of our past guests have been. And for myself, I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter at Ben_CoSchedule. Pretty open to talking to whoever about whatever. So if people want to find me there, I'd be glad to connect. All
right. Awesome. Well, Ben, thanks for joining me on Recorded Content today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Ben.